Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. We are getting you prepped for our upcoming Zoom session. It's on the moral teachings in Mark 12.3844.
Yeah, so we've got two contrasting stories in this passage. We have these flashy scribes who are obsessed with appearances, and then on the other hand, you have a poor widow who shows us what true generosity looks like.
Yeah, I know, right? It's almost like a crash course in humility. What it really means to follow, Christ's teachings.
Right.
And, get ready for some thought-provoking reflection questions with model answers, so stuff you can actually use in your daily life.
Yeah. So let's set the scene. We're in Holy Week in Jerusalem, just a few days before the crucifixion. Jesus is in the temple, surrounded by crowds, and he's about to drop some serious truth bombs on the scribes.
Okay, so back up for a sec. For those who don't know, who were these scribes?
So think of them like the legal scholars and religious leaders of their time.
Right.
They were the official interpreters of the law, wielding a lot of power and influence.
Yeah.
And they loved showing off their status. Think fancy robes, prime seats, greetings in the marketplace.
Got it. So they were all about outward appearances, but Jesus wasn't buying it.
Yeah.
He calls them out for devouring widows' houses, which sounds pretty terrible. What did he mean by that?
He was accusing them of taking advantage of vulnerable widows, likely through financial manipulation and abusive trust.
Oh, wow.
Basically using their position for personal gain.
So they were hiding their greed behind this facade of righteousness.
Exactly. And Jesus did not mince words. He said they would face greater condemnation.
Oh, wow.
Because of their actions. And, greater condemnation, that can be kind of a tough concept to grasp. It basically means facing harsher judgment because they knew better and still chose to exploit others.
That's pretty intense. But this isn't just ancient history, is it?
No.
I mean, it's like, who doesn't struggle with prioritizing appearances sometimes? I mean, think about it. We see it all around us today.
Absolutely, yeah. Whether it's,
Well-
business executives cutting corners, for-profit, or politicians making promises they don't keep. Or, even everyday folks, inflating their image on social media.
Yeah, totally. Makes you wonder, where do we get caught up in appearances instead of living with integrity? That's definitely something we'll be digging into during the Zoom session.
For sure. But let's move on to the next part of the passage, which takes us to a whole different scene.
Okay, so picture this. We're still at the temple,
Yeah.
but this time, Jesus is watching people. Put their offering into the treasury. The text even describes this clinking and clanking of coins, like it was a spectacle.
Yeah, it was a very public display,
All right.
And amidst all these wealthy folks showing off their generosity, a poor widow walks up.
And this widow only had 2 lepta to give.
That's right, 2 lepta. And lepta were the smallest copper coins, basically a pittance. But what's interesting here is that even though they were small, they represented, a significant portion of her daily earnings. It was likely all she had to live on.
Wow. And that's what Jesus calls out. He tells his disciples that this widow who gave just 2 tiny coins actually gave more than all the wealthy people combined. It's like, how can that be?
Right, because the rich were giving out of their abundance, so it cost them very little.
Yeah.
But the widow, she gave sacrificially everything she had. It was a true act of faith and trust in God.
Yeah, I used to think this story was just about giving money. But it's so much more than that.
Right.
It's about the posture of our hearts
Yeah.
and our willingness to let go of what we cling to, even if it seems small to others.
Exactly. And that's something we'll explore further in the Zoom session. We'll even dive into an interesting scholarly debate about whether or not Jesus is lamenting the widow's offering, seeing it as exploitation by the temple system.
No, that's interesting. So there are different interpretations of this passage.
Yeah. But, the prevailing view is that Jesus is actually praising her faith and sacrifice. And we'll be looking closely at the text to understand why.
That's something I'm really looking forward to. I bet our listeners are too.
Yeah, it's fascinating, how this story kind of challenges our assumptions about what true generosity looks like. We often think it's about the amount, but Jesus kind of flips that on its head.
Right. Yeah. It's a real mind bender. And it makes me think about all those times I've held back from giving, thinking my contribution wouldn't really matter.
Yeah, that's a really relatable struggle. And it's something we'll definitely unpack, during that Zoom session. We'll even have some practical exercises to help you identify ways to, practice that radical generosity in your own life.
I love that. Practical tips are always welcome. But before we get too far ahead, I think it's important to point out the contrast Jesus is painting between the scribes and the widow.
Absolutely. It's like he's holding up this mirror to our own hearts and asking, are we more like the scribes, focused on outward appearances
All right.
and self-preservation? Or are we more like the widow, willing to give sacrificially, even when it hurts?
That's a powerful question.
Hmm.
And it's definitely one we'll be diving deep into during our Zoom session.
Yeah, we'll have some thought-provoking reflection questions to kind of guide the discussion. For example, we'll be asking, how can we cultivate a heart of generosity that goes beyond, financial giving? And how can we discern when our giving is, motivated by a desire for recognition versus a genuine desire to serve?
Wow, those are some heavy-hitting questions. I'm already starting to feel challenged.
Good, that's good. That means we're engaging with the text on a deeper level. And that's the whole point of this deep dive. And the upcoming Zoom session, we want to help you move beyond simply knowing the story to actually living it out in your everyday life.
I love that.
Yeah.
Speaking of living it out, I think it's also worth mentioning that this passage in Mark isn't an isolated incident. Jesus talks about the dangers of wealth and attachment to material possessions throughout the Gospels.
You're right. It's a recurring theme.
Yeah.
Think about the parable of the rich fool who hoarded all of his wealth for himself, but was not, rich toward God. Or the story of the rich young man who couldn't bring himself to give up his possessions to follow Jesus.
That's an interesting phrase, rich toward God. What does that even mean?
It's a profound concept that we'll explore further during the Zoom session. It gets at the heart of what true wealth is all about. It's not about material possessions, but about our relationship with God and our willingness to use our resources to serve others.
So it's more about a posture of the heart than a bank account balance.
Exactly. It's about aligning our priorities with God's priorities, and that's something we can all strive for, regardless of our financial situation.
Yeah, I'm really starting to see how this passage is about so much more than just giving money. It's about a whole way of life, a way of being in the world that prioritizes generosity, humility, and service.
You got it. And the beauty of this passage is that it offers us both a warning and an invitation.
What do you mean?
Well, the story of the scribes warns us against the dangers of hypocrisy, greed, and seeking our own glory. It's a cautionary tale that reminds us to check our motives and make sure our hearts are in the right place.
That makes sense. But what about the invitation?
The invitation comes through the story of the widow. It's an invitation to embrace radical generosity, to trust God with all that we have, and to find true joy in giving sacrificially.
I love that. So it's not just about avoiding the bad, but actively pursuing the good.
Exactly. And that's what we'll be exploring during the Zoom session. We'll be equipping you with the tools and insights to help you live out these principles in your daily life.
I can't wait. I'm sure our listeners are eager to join us too. Speaking of which, do you have any final thoughts to share before we wrap up this deep dive?
Yeah, just this. I think this deep dive has hopefully given you a taste of the profound truths hidden within Mark 12.3844.
You're right. I feel like we've just laid the groundwork here, and the Zoom session is where we're really going to unpack these concepts.
Yep.
And, explore how they apply to our lives.
Exactly. Think, interactive discussions, practical exercises, and even, some model answers to those thought-provoking reflection questions.
Right. It's going to be so much more than just listening to us talk. It'll be a chance to share your own insights, ask questions, and connect with others who are on this journey with you.
And who knows, you might even walk away with a fresh perspective on what it means to be truly generous, not just with your money, but with your time, your talents, and even your whole heart.
That's the beauty of diving deep into scripture like this, right? It's not just about gaining knowledge, it's about transformation.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
So, are you ready to take the plunge? Join us for the Zoom session on Mark 12.3844. We can't wait to see you there.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you at the Zoom session.
Reflection questions based on the Mass readings for the 32nd Sunday in Ordinary Time. Model answers will be provided at the Zoom session. 1. What is the connection between King Ahab's actions and the drought in the land? 2. How is Jesus' sacrifice different from the Old Testament sacrifices? 3. What insights can we gain from Jesus' criticism of the scribes and Pharisees that are relevant to our own lives today? 4. What specific biblical story does the widow's sacrifice recall? Looking forward to see you at our Zoom session.